Hello and welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast. It's time for another episode of Gibbo's Corner. And this time we're going to look at the greatest number sevens of Newcastle United. I'm Adrian Musgrove, and of course joined by John Gibson. I've set John the task of listing from 10 to 1 the greatest number sevens to have ever worn the black and white shirt. John, before we get into the names that you've got written down, just explain to me first off, the importance of the number 7 shirt at Newcastle United and just how difficult it was to narrow down the list.
Very much so. It is an iconic shirt, the number 7, throughout football. I mean, if you look at the recent history of players, people of the caliber of George Best, Kevin Keegan, Kenny Dalglish, Brian Robson, the Man U guy, Cantona, David Beckham, Cristiano Ronaldo, all made the number 7 shirt iconic in that time, and they're the world's greatest footballers. And funny enough, as the number 9 shirt is the top shirt at Newcastle, at Liverpool, for example, it's the number 7s that are the great revered number. And of course, in doing this, as you were well aware, it almost splits into two, because initially, for donkey's years, the number 7 was the outside right, and you weren't personalised. It wasn't your shirt; it was the shirt of whoever was playing outside right. However, things changed when squad numbers come in 1993, whereby we all wore all different numbers. One of the first people to actually take advantage of that was a Geordie lad, Ray Kennedy, at Liverpool, after he was transferred from Arsenal. And he always played in the number 5 shirt, but never, of course, played centre half. And he just took that shirt. He was a left-sided midfield player in those days. I mean, nowadays you've got Bruno's number 39 because his dad, that was his taxi driver number. Lewis Miley's 67. So it is very much changed from the days it was. But what we are doing, we're talking about players who wore the 7 shirt, either in the old days because they played outside right before the numbers come in, or who wore the 7 shirts in the modern era. So it doesn't automatically follow that everybody in a 7 shirt played outside right. Far from it these days, of course. But that's the rules we played under.
Yeah, well, let's dive in with the first name. And you've gone for Stuart Barraclough, played for the club between 1970 and 1978, 219 appearances. Why is he the first name on the list?
Yeah, he gets into my top 10 simply because he was he played outside right with a 7 on his back in those days, between 70 and 78. And he was such an influence. Newcastle United were all about Malcolm MacDonald and John Tudor, the goal kings of Newcastle. But you've got to have a provider, and everybody thinks with Supermac the provider was Terry Hibbett, and to a great extent it was. But the effect this guy had on the front two at Newcastle was quite phenomenal. And it was mainly because he was super quick. Like Newcastle have got quick wide guys today in Almiron and Gordon, he was it in those days. I mean, he signed for Newcastle. He was only 19 years old when he joined Newcastle in July of 1970. He'd only played a handful of games for Barnsley, which was his hometown club, when Newcastle saw the potential in him and brought him to Newcastle. And that, as you well know, Andrew, we've talked about it many times, that's what Joe was great at. He saw players in the lower reaches of the game. He signed players from Leeds Reserves and from Barnsley and from Bury and all that, and made them stars at Newcastle United. And I always remember, just after Stuart signed, I was standing with Joe on the steps of St. James's Park outside the main entrance there, And all of a sudden, in the right-hand corner, came this Joe standing with a fag in his mouth, chatting away, and a scooter appeared up the hill and driving into St. James's Park. And there's this guy on the scooter with a fur-lined hoodie on, a big aerial on the back of the scooter up into the air, and it was Barrett coming in. And Joe stood there with a fag and he went, "Aye, Gibbo," he said, "that'll have to go. That bloody scooter's got to go," he said. And it was, of course, the mods and the rockers and all that. And there was little Barrett on his scooter arriving at Newcastle. I think these days people arrive in helicopters and go straight into the training ground in the helicopter. The little scooter in his day. But the wonderful thing about Barrett, and I got to know him ever so well, and he'd become a very, very good friend of mine. He was a likeable Yorkshire lad. He had the accent, was total Barnsley. He was full of fun. He was always smiling. He was the Miggy of yesteryear, Miggy Almiron. He played in that position. He played with a smile on his face all the time. He had Miggy Almiron's build, i.e. he was a toothpick, and he was a flyer. He was quick. So in lots of ways, he was the 1970s Miggy Almiron. He played for England under 23s, huge potential. And the daft thing about him, we used to go, because I was in those days the same age as the players. It's a little bit different these days, but in those days I was the same age as the players. And I hasten to add, on the right nights, we would go nightclubbing together. When I say the right nights, not a Friday night before a game on a Saturday, but midweek when there was no midweek games. And we used to go to a place called the Tuxedo Junction, and all the boys would meet in there. And Barrett was always the centre of the conversation, rolling about, laughing, full of fun. And Joe regularly got a phone call on the Thursday morning from anxious fans saying, "By the way, I saw Stuart Barraclough last night in the Tuxedo Junction. He was absolutely ratted on Bacardis and Cokes." And the truth of the matter was that Stuart Barraclough never drank. And Joe knew that, of course. He was drinking Coke. There was no Bacardi in it, but because he rolled about laughing and was so full of fun, everybody presumed that he was well gone 7 shades of colour. And he wasn't, but he was a very, very funny lad. The big story, and I've told it before, but I can't not tell it now when I'm talking about Barraclough, was the 74 Cup final, when Newcastle were playing Liverpool, the great Liverpool side. I mean, it was Keegan, it was Toshak up front, it was Highway on the wing, it was Emlyn Hughes. And Joe pulled him a couple of days before the final, pulled Barrett, and told him he wasn't playing. And not only was he not playing, but he wouldn't even be on the subs bench, because in those days there was only one sub. You name 9 now and put on 5. You only had one sub and could put on 1. And he was told that he wasn't going to play. Now, Supermac honestly believes and says to this day that any chance we had of winning that cup final went out the window when Barraclough wasn't playing. Because according to Supermac, when he played, Lindsay, who was the guy that was marking him, the left back of Liverpool, was absolutely terrified of his pace and worried to death about facing Barrett. Once he didn't have to face Barrett, he attacked like heck down our wing and caused all sorts of chaos. And McDonald and Tudor didn't get any of the service. They said, "We love Barrett." He skinned every fullback. And the minute he skinned the fullback, he hit the cross. He didn't do what Maxi did, go in, come out, flick the ball up his trouser leg, go in again. He was direct. You knew one touch past the fullback and he whipped it in at a nearer back post. And the 2 centre forwards attacked the 2 posts. This day, for some unknown reason, Joe decided not to go with him in the final. And I was down in the lobby area of the hotel, and I got a tip from one of the lads that said, "Hey, your mate away upstairs, he's absolutely decimated. The gaffer's just told him he's not going to play at Wembley." And I says, "Oh, he will be decimated." He says, "He's packing his bags. He's going to leave. He's going home because he's not even sub." And I thought, oh God, this would finish him. If he went home, you can imagine the headlines I would be writing them. You can imagine what they would be saying, cup final star walks out on team at Wembley, etc. It would finish his career. And I rushed upstairs, knocked on the door, went in the room. Sure enough, his bag was on his bed and he's thrown his stuff in the bag. And I said to him, look, pal, you've got to think about this. You've got to not do this. This won't work. This'll not just kill you at Newcastle United, but it'll kill you for other clubs signing you, because they'll think, oh, troublemaker, we don't need trouble. Who else can we buy instead? And I managed to persuade him not to do it. And I mean, a couple of people said later, well, you talked yourself out the best story you would have got, which is, you know, United star walks out on cup final eve. And that was true. But sometimes your friendship is more important than a one-off story, which 2 days later is in a fish and chip shop with a haddock on top of it. And to be quite truthful, I didn't do the chronicle out of a story either, because that cemented my relationship with Barrett and my relationship with several other Newcastle United players, that I had protected a guy that was vulnerable. And I got many stories many times over in the future because I'd done the right thing there. So, in fact, the chronicle didn't suffer as a consequence. We played Jinty Smith narrow that day in a congested midfield instead of playing Barrett and stretching the play. And I'm not having to go Jinky at all over this, because what a good player he could be on the right day. But we never got a kick. It was a 3-0 and we were lucky to get nil, as I say. And the wonderful thing that I was pleased about, Andrew, that finished off the story, was that it distraught Stuart Barraclough 2 years later played in a cup final at Wembley for Newcastle United. He was in the 1976 League Cup final side. And that justified so much. He was a joy as a person. He was Miggy. If you see Miggy today, always smiling, built like a toothpick, and whacking down that wing. That was Barrett. His best season was probably 1976 to 77 under Gordon Lee, when we finished 5th and qualified for Europe. And that was Barry at his absolute pomp. We sold him to Birmingham, and he went in an exchange deal for Terry Hibbert and John Connolly. Terry Hibbert coming back to Newcastle for one last hurrah. I mean, Barry himself, actually, such a colourful character. I mean, when he finished playing, he opened a florist and greengrocer's shop in Barnsley, because you didn't make enough money in those days to retire like the superstars of today. And he was like, I don't know if you ever saw Open All Hours, Ronnie Barker, who kept the corner shop. Yeah, well, that's what Barry did for the rest of his life after that. He also, believe it or not, managed Grimethorpe's Miners' Welfare to Wembley in the Carlsberg Pub Cup final, and which is a very little known fact about our Stewie, who you could never incidentally imagine as a manager. You know, it's like imagining I'm going back yet again. Miggy is a manager. You can't really see it is happening. And funny enough, his son, he had a son, he's got a son called Carl, and he followed in his dad's footsteps. He was a winger. At 19-year-old, he made his debut for Barnsley, his dad's old club, and went on as a sub at 19. And after 120 seconds on the pitch, he won a penalty. The score was 1-1 at the time, and Barnsley won as a result of the penalty. He won. He made 12 appearances in the Football League and then had a career in the non-league. But, a worthy scraper into the top 10, in my opinion.
Yeah, good place to start. I had Stuart Barclough down in 1098 in 7th place. That's where he was on my list. So I know that the names that John's going to bring to you guys, and I've done my own list based on those names, my own order. So I had Stuart Barclough in 7th. The next name John's going to bring you at number 9 is Jimmy Boyd. Outside right, 1925 to 1935, 214 appearances and 64 goals. I mean, I'm willing to bet that no one listening to this podcast will have seen him play. And probably not many have heard of him. So, John, why is Jimmy Boyd number 9 on your list?
Yeah. I mean, even I haven't seen him play.
I didn't want to say that though.
That's saying something. But sometimes if you're dealing with Newcastle as much as you can over the 130-year history, you can't ignore before the war sort of thing and say the world didn't exist until the end of the Second World War, and because that is infinitely unfair. I mean, this guy spent 10 years at St. James's Park. His highlight was he was in the team that won the FA Cup in 1932, and he gained his one Scottish cap 2 years later. I mean, you read out the figures there, Andrew. When you say 214 games, 64 goals, and he's just out-and-out outside right. That, and in those days, you didn't have goal-scoring wingers. I mean, Stanley Matthews must have went the whole of his club career, which lasted about 20-odd years, and scored about 5 goals, because wingers didn't in those days. But he had a very, very good record for a winger. I mean, he wasn't a flamboyant player. He wasn't a tricky like Bobby Mitchell that played in the 50s Cup final, who had all the Stanley Matthews tricks. This guy wasn't that at all. His two major assets were hitting the far post with crosses and scoring goals himself, as I've already mentioned. And in season 1931-32, and remember, that's the Cup final winning side, he scored 23 goals from playing on the wing. Played out-and-out winger the whole season and scored 23 goals. That is some performance. And you may remember from the history books, as I say, there's nobody going to be listening to this that actually saw the thing, but the 1932 FA Cup final become infamous in that it was the over-the-line final. It was called the over-the-line final because they were playing Arsenal, who were hot favourites with a team of the 30s, and we were 1 down in quarter of an hour. We levelled up just before half-time, and then come this most controversial goal ever in an FA Cup final. A lad called Davy Davison, who was a local lad at Newcastle, fed Jimmy Richardson, who was flying in the inside right position. He was running out of pitch. The ball was running away from him. He was chasing it. And just as it got to the dead ball line, he crossed it. And Allen, who was playing centre forward, headed the ball in. Richardson was a lad from mining stock, never go up the chase, headed it in, 2-1, Newcastle won the cup. They had no idea at that stage, there wasn't any VAR or anything of that nature. They had no idea of any controversy before the Arsenal manager was interviewed after the game on radio, George Allison, and he said the ball was over the line before it was crossed. The winning goal shouldn't have stood. There was no television doing it live in those days. So everybody piled into the news theatres or the film theatres to see Pathé News, which was on in between the two feature films, to see the picture of the over-the-line final goal. And, of course, the dispute's gone on to this day, whether it was over the line or not. And if anybody had asked me, I would have said, look in the record books, that'll tell you whether it's over the line or not. It was a winning goal and Newcastle won. But, I mean, the impact that Jimmy Boyd had on that run to Wembley, I just made a note of it here, shows how significant it is, bearing in mind he was an outside right. In the third round, he scored the goal that beat Blackpool in a replay to get us through. In the fourth round, we played Southport, who were a third division north side, played them up here. Boyd scored in the first minute of that game, but it ended 1-1. Replay ended 1-1 and Boyd scored again. And they had to go to a third game at Hillsborough, and Newcastle narrowly won 9-0 in the third game. So, I mean, his input on Newcastle United, I think it would be very wrong of me not to accept that if you're going to try to tell the whole history of Newcastle, Jimmy Boyd's got to figure in there somewhere.
So you've got him at number 9. I've got him at number 8 simply because of that FA Cup win and the longevity that he was at Newcastle United. Next on your list, we are going to come into the 21st century, John, and it's Jermaine Genius at number 8. Signed from Nottingham Forest for £5 million. He was the second most expensive teenager at the time. It didn't end in particularly good fashion once he moved to Spurs for just £7 million. Actually, I was quite surprised when I read that amount of money. I thought it would have been a little bit more. But how does Genius end up in this list of yours?
Yeah, well, first of all, he was of the modern era, quite obviously, and he played in number 7. Never played outside right, but he wore the number 7 shirt, and therefore he is an out-and-out number 7, as far as we are concerned, at Newcastle United. Played midfield, as you well know, but he wore the number 7 shirt. And to a great extent, he was the nearly man of football, in as much as he had unbelievable potential, wonderful potential. Never quite fulfilled it to the extent that he could. Yes, he played for Newcastle United. Yes, he played for Spurs. Yes, he played for England. But he could have been on the verge of a world great, but mainly due to injury in the middle and latter part of his career, he never quite become the man he might have become. I mean, he's the one that famously said on departing Newcastle that he couldn't live in a goldfish bowl, if you remember, and then went away to the capital, went to London. And a lot of people smiled at that and said, you can't live in the goldfish bowl, but you can live in the capital. But when you think about it, in fairness to him, it's easy to get lost in London, isn't it? Everybody's famous in London. You've got famous actors, actresses, famous pop stars, famous footballers, cricketers. You get lost. So he was right from that point of view. But if you play for Newcastle United and you live around the city of Newcastle, it is a goldfish bowl because everybody wants to talk to you, shake your hand. It's a wonderful goldfish bowl, in my opinion, and embrace it and enjoy it. But I always thought it was funny that Jermaine said he couldn't live in a goldfish bowl and had to get away from Newcastle and went to London. And then when he retires, he jumps in the biggest goldfish bowl there's possible to be, which is television, live television, and made a huge success of it, by the way. Not just sort of match of the day and a pundit who pops up on any channel you happen to put on, whether it's Sky,
BT,
the usual ones. He's there, and he's doing the one show, which isn't even sport, which is wonderful because it says so much about what a consummate professional he is. Handsome-looking lad made for television. I mean, he looks the part. But it's rather ironic, isn't it, that he had to get away from Newcastle for the Goldfish Bowl, but the television isn't the Goldfish Bowl, evidently. But there you are. But I mean, the interesting thing, he was bought by Bobby Robson in February of 2002. At that time, he was not yet 19, and had only played 39 games for Nottingham Forest in the second tier of football, yet cost a few million quid. 5 million when we bought him for 5 million, which was one of the most expensive teenagers in the whole game. And he was brought in originally. He was brought in to play outside, like he was going to replace Rob Lee as the box-to-box player for us. I mean, everybody called him JJ. Obviously, that was his nickname, if you like, at St James's Park. He forced his way into the England side, justifiably so. And if you remember, he played in an era of United's talented lightweights. I mean, they were all lightweight. They were all like toothpicks. I mean, if you remember, the famous three we had, and they could all play, was Jermaine Genius, Kieran Dyer, and Lee Bowyer. And as you know, Dyer and Bowyer ended up fighting each other on the pitch famously when we played Aston Villa It's in James's Park. What's sometimes overlooked by people about that game is that we actually finished with 9 men. Stephen Taylor, the centre-half, had already been sent off and was sitting in the dressing room. And I talked to Tails afterwards. And it was ironic because he realised he committed this foul and was going to get sent off, that he'd handled the ball. So he went down like a felled tree in the penalty area to try to fool the referee into he'd been hit in the face, etc., etc. Didn't fool anybody, and it just looked a joke. And he said, I'm sitting in the dressing room, absolutely in the silence of the dressing room, Tails, he says, and thinking, oh, God, because I'm going to get done by the manager. I think Souness was the manager. He said, and suddenly the door burst open and in walked Kieran Dyer. And 20 seconds later, in walked Lee Bowyer. And he thought, is the whole team going to come in sitting here next to me? Like, and we were down to, it was a farcical situation. But we had 3 good players. Kieran Dyer went, of course, didn't wear the 7th shirt. Jermaine Genius was wearing that. And Bowyer and Dyer had to wear other shirts. But there were 3 lightweights who could play in the middle of the park and could play well. And, you know, when he looks back on his career now, his football career, Jermaine has admitted that he says, I'm happy with my career, but yes, but for injuries, it could have been even better. And he said, ironically and rather nicely, I felt, he said that after Sir Bobby Robson left, a light went out for him. A light went out in his career, etc., because Bobby was so good for him. And I mean, the interesting thing, little facts, which I've loved because they're not so well known, his dad was called Dennis Genus, but Genus spelt with a G, Genas, but he changed his name by deed poll because he wanted the initials DJ. He must have fancied himself as a DJ. He wanted the initials DJ. So he changed his surname by deed poll to a J, Genas. And he'd been a semi-pro footballer, Dad. And that's how Jermaine Genius got the name and JJ, because their family name was spelled with a J. But, I mean, I think he's got a terrific career in front of him now as well, as a television personality. And of course, he's everybody's tip that in the day when Gary Lineker retires from Match of the Day, whether that's to become a politician or just who knows, but the tip is that it could well be Jermaine that takes over, and he's certainly got the personality to do so. But I think that when you saw the potential of the lad that come here before his 19th birthday and the impact he had on Newcastle United, you realised the talent was enormous.
He won the PFA Young Player of the Year as well at Newcastle.
Yes, he did.
Just Absolutely. How well he started and maybe reaffirms the fact that he didn't reach his true potential, at least not at Newcastle United. I had him 10th in my list, John, because I just felt there's others in this list that you've got who are more fitting of just have been ahead of Jermaine Genius. You know, a fantastic talent. Sad the way it ended, but that's football. On to the next then. At number 7, you've got Jock Rutherford. I'm going to tell you, actually, John, he's my number 1 in this list. I've gone for Jock Rutherford as my number 1.
Sensational. Absolutely.
You've got him as number 7. I've got him as number 1, and I'll tell you for why. Because I thought about picking the list based on players that I'd seen. So that narrows it down to Genius and a few others in the list, which I won't give away right now. Yeah. But then when I was doing the research, you know, I look at what Rutherford did at Newcastle, and you just think you can't really get better than him in terms of what he won, of what he nearly won. And for me, you know, the Newcastle Flyer deserves to be number 1 in my opinion. You've got him number 7. Let's just tell the audience a little brief thing about him. 1902 to 1913, 290 appearances, 78 goals. and I'll let John take it away from here to explain why he's in at number 7 in your list of the greatest number 7s.
I think if I'd seen him play, and I realise that you didn't, because you're a lot younger than me, so yet he's your number 1. But I'm a great believer when I can, Andrew, of rating people by my own eyesight, not by the history books, not by flickering black and white old films or anything like that, but in the main by what I've seen. And there's only, I think, Boyd and Rutherford that's really in this that I didn't see, because even the 50s players, I saw them as a small boy, and perhaps our rose-tinted glasses I had on in those days, but nonetheless, I saw them play. I didn't see this fella play. It's always difficult, with Hughie Gallagher. When you're talking about number 9s, we're talking about 7s here. I mean, Hughie Gallagher could be rated the best number 9 ever at Newcastle. He certainly skipped the side and was a top goal scorer when they won the championship for the last time in Newcastle's history, which was 1927. But unless you've seen him, how can you put him above Shearer? But on what he achieved, and he was about 3'6". He was Tom Thumb, and he headed goals and fought people and scored a barrel load. I mean, it is hard to do it, and for that reason, Jock is perhaps been slightly unfairly treated by me. I would certainly never have him as my number 1, but he deserves, I would think, to be higher than 7. But because I know the others and I'm much more comfortable with the others, the token 2 I've had to go for is Boyd and Rutherford from the past. And I mean, as you say, the honours board, I mean, this guy got 11 England caps. He won 3 First Division titles with Newcastle, 1905, 07 and 09. What a period that was with Newcastle. He was an FA Cup winner in 1910, an FA Cup finalist on 4 other occasions. 1905, 06, 08, and 1911. And he was a Geordie lad from Percy, Maine. So he was one of our own. But if the only criteria for somebody being in an individual list is the honours they won, then nobody would ever be in any list but that Edwardian team, because they won about 5 First Division championships, they played in 6 cup finals. So the best goalkeeper would be theirs, the best right back would be theirs, and say, why? Well, because he won 4 titles and 5 cups and 3 this, and it's fair. But in a team game, all 11 aren't superstars. Sometimes, Jock is, by the way, so I'm not having to go with that. But sometimes you can be an average player and be flipping lucky because you're in a superstar team. And therefore you get the same medals as Jackie Milburn, the centre forward, but you're not as good a player as Jackie Milburn. It sometimes happens that way. It didn't with Jock. Jock was very, very special. I mean, he made his Newcastle debut at 17 and scored on his debut. Both were a record at the time. By he was 20-year-old, he was capped by England, one of the youngest ever internationals. And he played for his country for over a decade. And as you said, he was known as the Newcastle Flyer. Interesting thing is, as he was approaching his 30th birthday, he fell out with the board over benefit payments. And in a fit of pico, because the board were too stingy, whichever way you want to look at it, he went off and signed for Arsenal for what was considered at the time to be his final hurrah. He achieved all this at Newcastle, won all the titles at Newcastle. He's nearly 30-year-old. Go down to Arsenal, you have a last quick hurrah. The last quick hurrah lasted 323 games he played for Arsenal. And he played on, I think, until he was almost 40. And like the Milburns, Jackie's family, the Rutherfords were a family of footballers. He come from a family of footballers. Remember, he's a Geordie lad from Percy, Maine. His brothers, Sepp and Bob, both had notable careers in football. Another brother, Andrew, was on Newcastle's books for a while. Jock's son, John James, also signed for Arsenal later on. And how amazing is this, Andrew? And what's the possibility of this happening? These little things. What's the possibility that Jock Rutherford and his son both played in the same Arsenal first team together. How often is that going to happen? That the father and son in football, where you finished any time in your 30s, in 1925-26 season, father and son were both in Arsenal first team together. I mean, that is quite unique, I would think. Absolutely.
It certainly is.
And one final piece of trivia, because I've looked to dig up a little bit of trivia for each one of these guys, because most people might know the facts, but if you select a little bit of trivia and say, "Oh, I didn't know that," I think they'll know this, but it is interesting. Is Jock Rutherford's great grandson is Greg Rutherford, who won the Olympic gold at the London Games in 2012 in the long jump. And that kid that won that, if you remember him, he had the ginger hair, etc., was a great grandson. So can we claim Greg Rutherford is an Olympian gold medalist is basically from Geordie stock? If you go back through Jock, he was from Geordie stock, so perhaps we can claim Greg as well. But yes, the guy, I think in an honest world, he would probably be somewhere between 1 where you put him and 7 where I put him. But that he unquestionably has to be in the top 10.
So there you go, Jock Rutherford, number 7. As I said, I've got him down as my number 1. It was a close run thing, given the other names in this list.
The great fun, Andrew, the great fun is that everybody that knows listening and knows watching will have a different opinion.
Yeah.
But isn't it wonderful, because it's just about opinion? Isn't that how we spend all our nights when we pop down the pub and getting discussions, and the discussion lasts all night while we throw about all the names about the best goalkeeper, the best centre forward, the best Newcastle team of all time. Wonderful. Love it.
Exactly. And the great thing about these lists as well, if we don't kind of close the criteria and make it really stringent, then these lists can be built around talent, memories, stats, history, and that's the beauty of it. We'll get on to number 6. And had I said a few years ago, John, that this fella would have made it into your top 10 of the greatest number 7s, there's a chance you would have said, well, he hasn't actually worn the number 7 shirt yet, Andrew. You must be knowing something I'm not. But even when he finally got his hands on the number 7 shirt, had I said he'd be in your top 10 list, you would have laughed me out of Tyneside. Ladies and gentlemen, number 6 in John Gibson's greatest number 7s of Newcastle United is only Joe Linton.
It is indeed. And he might be unique, because he makes my top 10 in number 7 shirts, and he makes me top 10 centre forward flops. And he qualifies in both those lists.
Amazing. The turnaround, isn't it? The contrast. It's a story.
It's phenomenal. It's phenomenal, because obviously he's another one like Jermaine Genius, who wears the 7 shirt, and you have a look. Pray God we see him again in number 7 shirt with the injury and the contract, but pray God we do. And by the way, we ought to. I think he's essential to be kept at Newcastle. Don't sacrifice him for financial fair play. You don't get many Joe Lintons in midfield with his build and his ability to put it about and his ability to play as well. But he's like Jermaine Genius. He wears the 7, but he never plays outside right. Funny enough, he played outside left, really, and did in Germany, and does occasionally for Newcastle. But it's staggering, isn't it? He would make pretty close to the top of my number 9 flops, and pretty close to the top of my number 7 greats. And that is the difference. And it's quite phenomenal when you think about it. I mean, by the way, who decided that he was a number 9 in Newcastle? And who gave him the number 9 shirt when that's iconic? I mean, that just about ruined him. That number shirt was so heavy on his back, and he's worn number 7 brilliantly. But if you think, if a guy that signed for Newcastle for £40 million, big bucks, still is in one of the top transfer fees paid by Newcastle United, and was as sensationally a flop as Joe was, and then completely changes his position, and not only gets a career out of it, but becomes a Premier League top performer and becomes a Brazilian international, the greatest legendary international side in the world is Brazil, and he becomes good enough as a midfield player. So that justifies him being in Newcastle's top 7 if he can play in midfield for Brazil, I would suggest. And he can play in midfield for Brazil. And by the way, if we want to think about how good he is, think about how Newcastle are missing him right now.
Yeah, indeed. And what I would just say to you guys watching and listening, we're actually recording this on the 22nd of February and it won't go out straight away. So in that time, Newcastle could have picked up a form. Joe Linton could have signed a new contract. So just bear that in mind with the things we are saying. But you are right, John. The moment he's out injured, he's going to be out until the end of the season. And Newcastle are much worse off for his absence. And what I love about Joe Linton, and I'll say to you, he's number 9 in my list, which was a difficult place to put him. But again, it was just based on what the others have achieved and the overall impact. But make no bones about it, I'm a huge fan. I've said on record, if it was him or Bruno and that was the choice you had to make, I'd be keeping Joe Linton. I think he's that important. He was my player of the season last year. And you've got the great story, as we've just said there, from flop to hero. He's just a tank in the middle. And when he's on his day, you know, he makes Bruno a better player and he makes Newcastle United a better team. He is so influential to Newcastle's high press or Newcastle's counter. And, you know, there's just something about him. And the opposition do not like going up against him because he's physical, he's clinical, he's got a bit of speed about him. And thankfully, John, he started adding goals to his game as well.
And it's quite amazing for me to think, and you just mentioned it there, how physical he is and what a big unit he is and how he uses that physicality to dominate the middle of the park. Hence the Patrick Vieira comparisons, which I think is a bit OTT at the moment, but it might well come because Patrick Vieira is one of the world's greats, but it might come. But, you know, I find it staggering that he's got such a physical impact on a game when he played centre forward, and I thought he was so timid in the penalty area. I thought he apologised for being alive when he was a centre forward, and yet now is Mr. Tough Guy, but also with a beautiful velvet touch on the ball as well. But I mean, the big thing that's ringed in his career, and I'm certain it's ringed in his diary, and he sends a thank you card to Eddie Howe every year on November the 21st, because that was the date in 2021 when he suddenly became a midfield player. And as we will all remember, and our younger listeners and viewers will remember, of course, because it was so recent, he'll also send a thank you card to Kieran Clark, because him getting sent off, getting a red card very, very early in the game, so Joe Linton dropped back to play there. And one of my very proud moments, Andrew, is that only a few weeks before that happened, I'd written in one of my columns, and I'll tell you the story behind that, I'd written in the column that I believed that Joe Linton, the flop centre forward, could actually play in midfield. And I based it on the fact that he would have the power and height like Vieira because of his size, that he has a good touch on the ball, so therefore you can play middle of the field, that when he played in the middle, a lot of the game was happening in front of him. Instead of you play as a number 9, it's happening behind you, or you've got to have your back to goal, so he could see the play, and with his good touch, he might well be able to save his career in that position. I didn't realise that the change was going to come so quickly after that. The reason I wrote that article, well, I had been thinking about it, and I had been thinking about the wonderful change that was made by my dear friend Ray Kennedy, who played centre forward for Arsenal, was bought by Bill Shankly for Liverpool as a centre forward, and ended up as a midfield, a left-sided midfield player that won everything possible at Liverpool and was converted into that by Bob Paisley, a Geordie, a northeastern man anyway, a Durham guy. And because I had this feeling, and I thought, am I being foolish? I can see this. And he desperately needs to save his own career, even if he goes away from Newcastle. He's never a centre forward. So I talked to a coach who I've got great respect for, and I said, look, I'm not trying to get a story out of your quote. I just want to run this ridiculous idea past you and see what you think. And I ran the idea past him, and the coach, who I knew had changed positions of other players before in his coaching career and done it quite successfully, was very much for this and said, you're absolutely right. Because the one thing he isn't, John, he said, is a centre forward. And I said, well, I wish somebody had told Newcastle United that, because they not only played him there, but they give him the number 9 shirt. I mean, if you're not a number 9, to wear that shirt must be so heavy on your shoulders as to be untrue. He was really in outside left in the old-fashioned terms. But I ran it past this coach, and when he sort of said, no, I can see where you're coming from, and it is a distinct possibility, then I carried my opinion in print in the Chronicle, never thinking that it would come to fruition so quickly after that. And well done, Eddie, for doing it. And it saved his career. It saved Newcastle, and it saved Newcastle a fortune, because they got a midfield player when they would have got about 5 million for him as a centre forward if they'd sold him on as a centre forward. And quite frankly, now, if anybody tried to buy him out of Newcastle, it would cost twice as much as Newcastle paid for him, because that's how good he is. And it's been terrific to see. And you know why it's really terrific to see? He's such a good guy. And he handled the deluge of abuse that he got as a centre forward. And he didn't get any from me. He said he wasn't good enough to play there, but never got abused. But social media can be horrendous. And he handled that and still kept going. He admitted at times he wondered whether he'd made a huge mistake coming to Newcastle because of the way his career had turned out. And now, he's a Brazilian international and a flipping good one. You don't win Brazilian caps easily. And he's played for Brazil alongside Bruno. He's big Nate. And I had to put him in the list. And I think he deserves to be in the list. And you know what? If he signs that new contract, sign it, Big Joe, because you could fly up that list by the time you retire at Newcastle. You could fly up from being number 6 to somewhere very close to the top. So good on you, big man.
Yeah, there's the invitation. There's the incentive. Joe Linton in at number 6 in the greatest number 7s of Newcastle United. On to number 5 then. And a man who probably doesn't get as much credit as he should do. We saw a couple of home games ago, wore flags, unveiled a much-needed tribute to this fella, a man with a fantastic goal-scoring record, but overshadowed somewhat because he was often playing alongside Jackie Milburn. In at number 5, John, is Len White. I'll just read out the stats there. 153 goals in 269 appearances for Newcastle United. That sort of says it all about just how good he was. Why is he on your list, and why is he at number 5?
Yeah. Well, to a lot of older Newcastle fans, the first thing they say when you mention Len White is the greatest striker who never got an England cap. And they would put him in, he's a number 9 legend. The number 9 legend. I'll explain the difference in a moment and how he's made this list. He's a number 9 legend, and people will put him in the top 5 Newcastle centre forwards. Once you go Shearer, Milburn, Supermac, and Hughie Gallagher, a lot of people will go Len White after that. And he was that good. But the interesting thing, he ended up being a number 9 legend, but Newcastle bought him from Rotherham as an outside right, and he played in the number 7 shirt in his first 5 seasons at Newcastle United. He was an outside right, and Milburn was a top centre forward, etc. He cost only 12,500 quid. And he was bought to be cover for Tommy Walker on the right wing. In his first 5 seasons at Newcastle, he played as a number 7. Before he was then switched to centre forward when Jackie left us, etc. During the 50s, Newcastle, it was interesting because during the 50s, which was Newcastle's great FA Cup period, and the last time we had success in the FA Cup, during the 50s, Newcastle liked to play with contrasting wingers. On one side, they had the Dazzler, which was the nickname. He was a Bobby Dazzler, which was Bobby Mitchell, which was all the trickery, almost at walking pace, like Stanley Matthews, flick the ball up his trouser leg, round the back, over his shoulder, and almost done at walking pace, which is how the great Stanley Matthews played. And on the other side, they liked the direct speed merchant on the right-hand side of the wing. And first, that speed merchant was Tommy Walker, and then the speed merchant was Len White. And the great thing about Len, he was hugely enthusiastic. He was very, very quick. He was an opportunist. He could sniff where the ball was going to drop, and he had a vicious, vicious shot. And of course, we talk about, well, what's the pinnacle? What's the highlight? He did play outside right for Newcastle United in the 1955 FA Cup final, which is the last time Newcastle won the FA Cup. Remember that, boys, when we played Blackburn and hopefully try to keep going in the FA Cup this season. It would be nice. The last time our outside right was Len White. But the interesting thing about that, and people only remember teams, you know, Andrew, and, you know, he's outside right, but he wasn't going to play in the cup final. Reg Davies was selected to play in the cup final, but he dropped out at the last minute through having laryngitis, and Len White was drafted in to play on the right wing. And it was his first corner inside the first minute, something like 40 seconds. Inside the first minute, Newcastle got a right wing corner. Len White took the corner. Jackie Milburn rose majestically in the air to head the ball past Bert Troutman, and Newcastle were 1-0 up. And how did Jackie Milburn, who was not known as a header of the ball, in fact, if he had one weakness in his game, Jack, that was it, in the air. Because he was blisteringly fast, he was powerful, and he had a cannonball shot, but he wasn't good in the air. The other centre forward, because they played twin strikers, was Vic Keeble, who couldn't play anywhere bar in the air, and he was dynamite in the air. So when the corner was about to be taken, they put about 3 men on Vic Keeble and forgot to mark up Jackie Milburn completely. Len White spotted it, dopped it onto Jackie's head, and he stuck it in the net, and Newcastle were 1 up in the fastest goal scored in the cup final. And that was the famous cup final. I mean, the team was crazy. Reg Davies was supposed to play instead of White, and then went out with laryngitis. Dougal Livingstone, who was the manager, when he submitted his cup final team to the board, Jackie Milburn wasn't in it. He wasn't playing Jackie Milburn. And Stan Seymour, who had been manager in 51, 52, and was the influential man on the board, took one look at this team sheet, tore it up, threw it in a wastepaper basket, and said, Jackie plays. Newcastle don't go out at Wembley in a cup final without Jackie Milburn, who had been centre forward in 51 and 52. And that was the end of Livingstone's career, of course, as Newcastle manager. But, I mean, the interesting thing was Bob Stokoe, who played for Newcastle in that 55 cup final, and later would know what he did with Sunderland as the manager. And there's a statue outside the Stadium of Light in honour of him. He said, and I quote, and he said it to me as well as he said, Len White would have been one of the greatest players ever if only he believed in himself. He didn't know how good he was. And if he suffered from anything on a particular day, it was self-doubt when he had nothing to be doubtful about. And the amazing thing is, he was only 5'7", you know, and he played centre forward, and he leapt like a salmon in the air for head, and he headed many, many goals, but he had very strong neck muscles, and he got up there and was able to power the ball. A bit like Hughie Gallagher, who was even smaller than that and was terrific in the air. By 1957-58 was his breakthrough season as a centre forward at Newcastle, and he established what later on, after the cup finals, when this was after the cup finals, Newcastle had an unbelievable front three of Easton, White and Allchurch. They were so talented. And you know what was still went down? They were three of the greatest players, not only at Newcastle, but in the country at the time, and we still got relegated, season 1960-61. Why did we get relegated? Well, those three led Newcastle attack, and we scored 86 goals. And we were relegated because we let in 109. It was absolutely ridiculous. And I mean, Jackie, I used to work a lot with Jackie after he finished playing, and I wrote 3 or 4 of his books, ghosted them for him. He became a dear friend. And he told me that there was 2 inches had prevented Len White becoming England's regular centre forward. And that 2 inches was in height. He was 5'7". He said if he'd been 5'9", he would have automatically been centre forward, because there were, in those days, the England managers believed you had to be told to be a centre forward, and he was only 5'7". The nearest he got to England cap, he made 2 appearances for the Football League. In those days, Andrew, there was the leagues, Football League, Scottish League, Irish League. They had representative sides, which was almost like England B, if you like. And he made 2 appearances for the Football League against the Irish League and against the Scottish League. And against the Irish League, in the season 57-58, Len White was picked ahead of Brian Clough. Nat Lofthouse pulled out of the Football League side, and White was picked ahead of Brian Clough to play against Irish League. He scored a hat-trick in a 7-minute spell in front of the Kop. The game was at Liverpool. In the Football League won 5-2. And again, one of these little quirks, and I love this, I always do. ITV were heavily criticised at the time because the Football League v the Irish League game, they only broadcast part of the game. And they only showed 2 of England's 5 goals on the telly afterwards, and none of Len White's. The 3 England goals that didn't show, or the Football League goals that didn't show, were the 3 scored by Len White. And so he never got the adulation out of that might have produced his first England cap. But it was funny in those days. I mean, it's so different to today. When he first came to Newcastle, he worked as a plate layer at Burton Colliery. He was playing outside right for Newcastle, and he worked as a plate layer at Burton Colliery, continued to work there till March 1956. That was after he started in the 55 Cup final. He was working down the pitch when he started in the 55 Cup final, which is absolutely incredible. And during his time at Newcastle, he got called up for national service. And he had to tell the Labour Exchange, the local Labour Exchange, that he worked down the mines. Because if you worked down the mines, you didn't do national service because you were essential to the... And of course, if you're a miner during the war, you didn't get called up for the war because you were essential to the war effort. So, but he started in the 1955 Cup final when he was working at Burton Colliery. Quite, can you imagine that these days?
Quite amazing, isn't it? And for someone who maybe didn't believe in themselves, it's fantastic to see him 3rd on the all-time record for goal scorers at Newcastle United. Of course, Alan Shearer top, Jackie Milburn 2nd, and then Len White, and with 153 goals for Newcastle United. And you know, but scary to think that someone like Bob Stokoe thought he could have become an even bigger and better player. I mean, imagine the kind of heights that Bob was imagining when he said that to you, and wherever else he put it, it would have been something scary to say the least.
And can you imagine ending up the 3rd highest goal scorer on the list you've mentioned, Andrew, and you spent your first 5 seasons in Newcastle playing outside right?
Yeah,
and scored he still ended up with all them goals.
Amazing, isn't it? He's number 2 on my list, actually, John. He's in at number 2 because I do think I'm a big fan of Len White. You know, I do a lot of reading around it, and I do think he's one of those names, one of those players who does get forgotten about by a lot of fans, and it's not necessarily their fault because, as you said right at the start of the show, John, you know, those who are more in the present get remembered better than those who are 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, and that's just the way of the world. But it is quite something, given his tally, that he does often get left out of the conversation when we talk about great goal scorers, which is a shame, but that's why we're here today. And if you're a younger listener, you're not too sure of Len White, you can have a little read. You know, you can't help but be impressed by what he achieved at Newcastle United.